Hello Year 12 students, this is Richard II, Act 2, Scene 1. This is a long scene and fairly typically of Shakespeare's texts. The beginning of Act 2 is used to further the plot. All of the key themes and ideas have been established in Act 1, what you might call the exposition, and Act 2 then seeks to build on this. So we're not really going to see any new things crop up in terms of the way that the characters are, their motives and their actions. It's a continuation of what's gone before. So the scene begins with John of Gaunt, and the key detail there is that word sick. He is sick, and that informs what we see and what we read. Gaunt begins by saying, is the king on his way to listen to his advice? And that's what we're going to do here, is just sort of talk through the scene in terms of what's actually happening, and the questions on the side might inform me from time to time. York responds by saying that there's no point trying to give him counsel, good advice, because it would all be in vain. He's not interested in advice. And that's where Gaunt begins his extended speeches. Despite being sick, the length of his speeches denote the strength of his passion, his intellect, his articulacy. And what he's really saying throughout most of these next couple of pages is that Richard II is not open to good advice. What you should notice in these opening words of the scene is Shakespeare's use of natural imagery. This is common throughout the text, but here's a fairly obvious example: a reference to the setting sun, music at the close, the last taste of sweets. He's talking here about endings, and by endings he's talking about the ending of his life, Gaunt's life. And he's also saying there that with age and with age comes experience. He hopes, and you can see the highlighted line there already, that news of his impending death will help Richard II to see the error of his ways. And York tells him that, well, that's not going to happen, because he gets his advice from other people who flatter him. And so we're learning about Richard through the views of other characters, from their perspective. And they're saying that Richard is a man full of pride. And being full of pride, he listens to the words that are complimentary to him, and that makes him weak. You can see the reference at the top of the page there to the fashions in Italy. And what we have here is York discussing how Richard II's efforts to rule are an attempt to imitate, as it says there, to copy other civilizations. And so what we then see from Gaunt is a fairly lengthy and famous description of the power, the beauty, the wonders of England. And the speech that we're going to come across is one of those speeches that's often used as a sort of fairly typical Shakespearean example of celebrating patriotism. So as we move down there, this is, as you can see, the bottom right there, it tells you of this being one of Shakespeare's most famous speeches. And when you read this, hopefully what it does is it reminds you to some degree of Romeo and Juliet. He says here, violent fires soon burn out themselves. You may remember in Romeo and Juliet, the friar says to Romeo that these violent delights will have violent ends. What we then have is a series of examples, each of which is sort of saying that with excessive passion, with youth, with reckless and rashness come mistakes. So he says here, small showers last long, but sudden storms are short. If one engages in war, as Richard is looking to do, well, the storm being a metaphor for war, perhaps, well, that brings about an end. If you ride too fast, if you spur too quickly, that brings about an end more quickly. If you eat too much, well, you might choke on it, and so on it goes. As we move into the next page, oops, there we go. He kind of continues this. Now, I mentioned previously about the discussion of patriotism, and there's a lovely line there which just begins to demonstrate that, I think. Yellow. Because he's referring to this other Eden, this demi-paradise. Well, that's England he's referring to there. England is a fortress built by nature herself, because England is an island. It's made strong because of its isolation from the rest of Europe, perhaps. So here we have we have John of Gaunt celebrating England, and Richard II's desire to go to other lands and conquer them is suggestive of a man who has delusions of grandeur and fails to recognise the value of what he has in front of him. I think that's what John of Gaunt is trying to tell us about here. At the bottom, we could analyse almost every single line, but I don't think that's strictly necessary. At the bottom of this particular page, John of Gaunt says, "Dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or a pelting farm." Well, a tenement is a building usually, but some land, a building that's used by many people. And he's saying here that England, this great nation which used to be famed throughout the world, is no longer England because it's being used for the motives of others. Here, look at this line, the third line down. England wants to conquer others and has made a shameful conquest of itself. So in trying to go to other lands, it's conquering itself. So we know what Gaunt's view is going to be as Richard comes in. As Richard comes in here, look, one of these sort of Shakespearean devices. The sheer number of people he has with him reveal his importance. He's got like a little train of people. It's worth noting who those people are. His wife, Ormel, we know is loyal to him. Bushy, Green and Bagot are loyal to him. But Ross and Willoughby will not be. And we'll see that by the end of the scene. So what Shakespeare is trying to do here is sow the seeds of division. Because at the minute, those highlighted people in yellow are all on the same team, as it were. But by the end of this scene, there will be division. And Shakespeare is perhaps sowing the seeds for the rest of the plays in this particular series. Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2. Because it's the division of this house, of this monarchy, which brings about the division that is seen in English history in the 50 to 60 years that follow it. So they ask how Gaunt is, and Gaunt uses chiasmus. So chiasmus. Now it tells you on the right hand side to find examples of chiasmus, but what you might find helpful is if I give an example of it. This is not in the text. Never let a fool kiss you, or a kiss fool you. So what we have, what is chiasmus? It's a figure of speech where the sort of first half of the phrase is repeated but in an inverted or backwards, a different order. And so the purpose of chiasmus is typically to reveal intellect, wit. Gaunt here is dying, but we'll see lots and many examples of chiasmus, because even though he is dying, his ability to craft his words carefully reveal him to be an intelligent, very capable man who Richard should be listening to, and who we, the audience, should also be listening to as well. So an example, just in the second line of that speech: old Gaunt indeed, and Gaunt in being old. He's saying there that yes, I'm old. I, John of Gaunt, am old, but I'm also gaunt in being old. To be gaunt means to be frail, and so he is sort of playfully referring to his own sickness, his own illness. As we move down, some of that continues, that chiasmus, and you can see from the shortness, the brevity is a better word, the brevity of their utterances to one another, that what we have is a sort of back and forth between them. Some of the key lines here. Let's go for, it's all significant. Gaunt says here, I can make that work. Oh no, you die, though I the sicker be. So you are dying, but I'm sicker. Richard says, I'm in health, I breathe, and I see that you're unwell. And so what Gaunt is saying here is he's referring to Richard's metaphorical sickness, the sickness of him as a bad king. We have another reference to how one's reputation matters. And when we come to study Othello, we're going to see that this is another recurrent theme in Shakespeare's work. That reputation, reputation, reputation. Those will be the words of Michael Cassio. And we know that reputation precedes a man. And so Richard's sullied reputation, sullied, S-U-L-L-I-E-D, his sullied reputation is particularly significant. So Gaunt tells him the truth, and he tells him that truth because he's dying anyway. He's got nothing to lose. He is made bold by the reality of impending death. 1,000 flatterers sit within your crown, whose compass is no bigger than your head. Compass may be a reference to the moral compass. That these men are corrupt, and they're making the king corrupt, and they're making the concept of the monarchy corrupt. In those lines that are highlighted in green, Richard II is... Sorry, let's rephrase that. Gaunt hopes really that were his father, Edward III, still alive, he could have prevented this from happening. That he could have deposed Richard II before he were possessed with the role of king. He rather implies here that, in this line here, Richard II is inclined now to depose himself. He doesn't realise it, but he is putting his reign as monarch at risk. He says, why, cousin, if you were regent of the world, it were a shame to let this land by lease. But for thy world, enjoying but this land, is it not more shame? Is it not more than shame to shame it so? If you were in charge of the whole world, it would still be a shame to let the wonder that is England suffer and to lease it out to others. But given that this is yours and this is your land, does that not make it even worse? And he calls him a landlord of England. And so he is using the language of impermanence. And as a consequence of that, these hyphens they denote interruption. Richard is angry. lunatic, a lean-witted fool, presuming because of your sickness and ague that you can say what you like. And he's not so happy. If you weren't brother to great Edward's son, those highlighted lines again, then I wouldn't accept it, is what he's implying there. Gaunt says, don't bother sparing me. Maybe it's easy to be brave because he's on his last breaths anyway, his last legs. But we can see that Gaunt is impassioned here. And so as we move on, and as we see Gaunt's last words in the scene and the play, he says, live in thy shame, but die not shame with thee. These words hereafter thy tormentors be. And so, perhaps typically of Shakespeare's work, we have an old, experienced, dying character passing on some wisdom to a younger character. A wisdom? Is it wisdom or is it a curse? But we know, let's again refer back to Romeo and Juliet, when we have a character of any kind of wisdom or knowledge issuing a curse on others, it tends to come into being. These words will torment him. Richard will die in shame. He will live in shame and he will die in shame. The question on the right hand side there says, does Richard, is there any redemption at all? And I'll leave you to consider that one as we read on through the play. So Gaunt goes and Richard and York are left on the stage. And because of his sickness, York asks Richard to not look too negatively on what John of Gaunt has just said. Instead, you can see in the highlighted words there that he says that John of Gaunt loves him as he does his son, Harry, Duke of Hereford, who we call Bolingbroke. As the annotation on the right hand side says, really? Really? Does he? Really? We know that's not quite true. And so maybe York is falling into the role of another flatterer. But York's function in the next part of the scene is to demonstrate the difficulties of his own inner conflict as to what the right thing to do is. He feels loyalty to his nephew, Richard II, the king, and also love for his brother, John of Gaunt, as well. And so Richard here is saying specifically, that's alright, let's come back. Richard is saying here specifically that John of Gaunt was a ripe fruit. He was wealthy. That the wealthiest fall first, and that's what's happened to John of Gaunt. And he's going to use that to pursue his war in Ireland, and that's what you can see in the purple lines there. The plate, coin, revenues, movables whereof our uncle Gaunt did stand possessed. He's going to use those. And York hears that and wonders if this is likely to be the same for him as well. How long shall tender duty make me suffer wrong? I'm loyal to you, but he's questioning aloud whether that's the right thing to do. He lists here the problems. The death of Gloucester, his brother. And I rather glossed over it earlier in this particular scene, but John of Gaunt outright said to Richard II that was his doing, that it was Richard II who brought about the death of Gloucester. And York here is saying, yes, the death of Gloucester, the banishment of Bolingbroke, his own disgrace, he says. He's been loyal throughout all of these things, and that he's the last of them now living. The last of noble Edward's sons. He wasn't the last born, but he's the last living. And he really is querying as to what's going to happen to him. Is he doing the right thing or not? He finishes this particular sort of section by saying, York is too far gone with grief, or else he would never compare between. And so he tries to excuse his open. He tries to excuse his open wondering as to what will befall him by saying that it's the loss of his brother that's causing the problems. Richard, this line kills me. Why, uncle? What's the matter? It's like he really hasn't been listening. He doesn't care. And so when York, the Duke of York, Ormond's father, same person, when he does eventually decide to sit with Bolingbroke and Bolingbroke's attempts or efforts to claim the crown, it's lines like that which push him towards it. York then continues. You can see the lines highlighted in green, that he tries to speak on behalf of Bolingbroke, that he's the heir to Gaunt's riches, and therefore he deserves them, that he should get them back when he is no longer banished. Hereford is alive. Isn't Harry true, he says? Isn't he deserving of it? And he warns Richard, if you take Hereford's rights away and take from time his charters and his customary rights, let not tomorrow then ensue today. If you take his possessions, if you take what's rightfully his, you're going to cause yourself a problem. Look at yourself, he says. How are you a king but by fair sequence and succession? You are here because of succession. Bolingbroke therefore deserves his father's wealth because of succession. And if you get this wrong, he says, if you don't do this, see the lines in red, you pluck 1,000 dangers on your head, you lose 1,000 well-disposed hearts, and prick my tender patience to those thoughts which honour and allegiance cannot think. If you take Bolingbroke's rightful inheritance, you're going to make people unhappy, and you'll even cause me to wonder if I should be loyal to you. Richard says, don't care, think what you will, we're doing it. And York says, right, well in that case I'll not be around for a while. I need time, is rather the implication of this. Now all the way through this, there have been other characters listening to it, hearing it as well. And we can see them all here. The Queen, Ormond, Bushy, Green and Bagot, Northumberland, Willoughby and Ross. And this is where that division occurs. So Richard goes and says, right, we're going to leave we're going to leave the Duke of York as the Lord Governor of England because he loves us and he's always on our side. He always does what we want him to do, which is another sort of fatal flaw. He really hasn't been listening to what the Duke of York has just been telling him. And those other characters who've been hearing it, Northumberland, Willoughby, Ross, they break. Now the note at the bottom here says, the last few pages of this scene dramatise the immediate consequences of his rashness. The three nobles at first pronounce their disaffection warily, but are soon assured that they can speak their treasonous thoughts without fear of betrayal. Their mutual trust suggests how outrageous the king's actions have been, and how solidly the aristocracy has joined ranks against him. And that's really what we see here now. They confirm that John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, is dead. Ross says he's living as well because Bolingbroke is his son, and he is now the Duke. Willoughby responds, well, he's got the title, but he doesn't have the money. And Northumberland, who is perhaps the boldest of them, says, well, he'd have them both if things were just. And it's Northumberland who encourages the other two to speak their mind. And we can see here that there's a reiteration of what's been said earlier. Northumberland says here, the king is basely led by flatterers. He listens to people who tell him what he wants to hear. Ross reinforces how Richard has taxed the nobles and lost their hearts. We move on. This is where Northumberland tells us of why Richard needs the money. He claims that Richard has claimed that he wants the money to fund this war in Ireland, but Willoughby says he's grown bankrupt like a broken man. Northumberland says he's spent more in peace than in war. His desire for grandeur, his desire to appear great, has led to him spending money that he doesn't have, and that makes him weak as well. And as we move into the next part of the scene, at the bottom of the page, Willoughby says, let us share thy thoughts as thou dost ours. Be confident to speak. We three are but the same. We're with you. Therefore be bold. And that's when Northumberland reveals this list of people who are siding with Bolingbroke. Harry, the Duke of Hereford. Lord Cobham, the heir to the Earl of Arundel, the Duke of Exeter, the brother of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and more. They're all coming over from France, 3,000 men of war, and they're going to touch down in this northern shore. On a map of England, this would be sort of around Hull, East Yorkshire, and far away from London. They'll make their way, and they're going to do it when the king departs for Ireland, the first departing of the King of Ireland. Look at that mocking tone. Richard II is not the King of England. He's the king. He's the king off on his way to Ireland. And if they do that, they will shake off their slavish yoke. A yoke being a harness you'd put on a horse that would enable it to drag a cart or something particularly heavy. And they seek to empower Bolingbroke. And that kind of finishes the scene, really. That's what they're looking to do. So, a long scene, a pivotal scene in terms of plot development and furthering the motives of the characters. The thing to do from here on, and there'll be some work to enable this to happen, excuse me while I scroll backwards, is that there are some scenes which are richer in their use of language than others. And for instance, where we have Gaunt giving his thoughts on England, we're going to see lots and lots of natural imagery which celebrate the purity of England. When we have Gaunt, first talking to Richard, there is this use of chiasmus, this wordplay, which is particularly interesting. And it's these sections that you need to focus on. To succeed in this unit, aspects of tragedy, elements of tragedy, you must know the plot. You don't have to know every single word in the text, but we need to know the plot, what happens, when it happens, why it happens. And then within that, we focus and zoom in on some of the key ideas which reveal the flaws of Richard and what makes the play a tragedy. That's what we need to do. If we do it, we're likely to do quite well in our writing.